Hi, I'm Ali Muldrow, the host of A Public Affair on Wednesdays. If you'd like to tune into my show any day of the week, any hour of the day, head on over to wortfm.org, and while you're there, make a donation to support community radio. Good afternoon, Madison. You're listening to WORT 89.9 FM. I am your host, Ali Muldrow, and this is A Public Affair. Happy Wednesday, everybody. It's been about a year since Madison experienced its most deadly school shooting at a private Christian school in town. It's been about a year and a half since we talked to David Riedman, who is the founder of K-12 School Shooting Database and the host of the podcast Back to School Shootings, after a different school shooting happened nearby Madison. David, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing well, but I'm sorry we have to continue to discuss this topic.
I think it's really tragic that we continue to have this conversation. I also think it's really important to have this conversation with someone like yourself, David, who, forces us to have the conversation in a really accurate way and a real clear understanding of the dynamics that inform school shootings right now. I think one of the things that I remember from our last conversation was you really helped me as a member of Madison's Board of Education reconsider some of how we were investing in preventing school shootings, because so much of our effort goes into keeping someone out of the building. And one of the things you made very clear was that the majority of school shootings are perpetrated by somebody who goes to the school, somebody who has every right to be there. Talk to me a little bit about how the shooting in Madison aligns with shootings in schools more broadly, what made our school shooting unique, and what made it the kind of school shooting that we should all be really aware of and look out for, because it is occurring frequently throughout our communities.
With any topic, there's always the public narrative about it, and then the actual evidence-driven framing of the issue. And with school shootings, the thing is, it's very personal, it's very emotional, and for a community member or parent, it's much easier to think there's going to be a bad person, they're deranged, they're mentally ill. If we can just keep them out of the school, if we can have a tall enough fence, if we can have an armored door, if we can have somebody with a gun who can shoot them, then we will be safe, because we need to keep that other away. Unfortunately, when you look at the data, and I've analyzed almost 3,400 shootings at schools back to the 1960s, about 230 of which were a deliberately planned attack at the school, which Madison is. The vast majority of those shootings are a current student at the school or a recently former student at the school. And this makes sense because school shootings, just like this one in Madison, are violent public suicides, where there's a student who develops a grievance, they blame the school for everything that is going wrong in their life. With teenagers, the school is the center of their life. Their sports are there, their activities are there, their friends are there, they spend most of their waking hours there. So it makes sense for the school to be the area that they blame for this violence. And then when their crisis escalates to the point where they think, I have no other path, the only thing that I can do to right this grievance is to commit this act of mass violence, which I'm going to die during, then that shooting takes place. And it's almost always a surprise attack committed by a student who's allowed to be in the school. They pull a gun out of a backpack, or they've somehow concealed it to sneak it in. The shooting usually takes place, it begins and ends in the same room, and it's almost always over before the first police officer even has time to arrive at the school. And that's just a very uncomfortable reality for people to face, because it's so much easier to say we just have to keep the bad people out, when in reality it might be a 15-year-old girl who is that person, and they're sitting right in your classroom in front of that teacher every day.
I really appreciate that reframing. I think it's really hard. I think when people think about school, people think about private Christian school, I think a lot of people would say, I want my kid to go to a private school, a private K through 12 school, because I think it's safer. because I think they'll have more one-on-one support from adults. Talk to me a little bit about the stereotype that our public schools and our urban schools are so much more dangerous than our private schools and our rural schools and our suburban schools.
Yes, that's the other big misconception from looking at the data. Overwhelmingly, the planned attacks, especially the high casualty planned attacks, take place in rural schools or small suburban communities. So these are exactly the places where people say something like this could never happen here. For example, just this week, about 2 hours south of Minneapolis, on Friday morning, there was a high school wrestling student who was getting onto the bus, and it's a community of 6,000 and a school of just a couple hundred in rural Minnesota. And as that student is getting on the bus to go to the wrestling meeting, everybody hears the crack of a rifle, and that student falls with a critical injury. And then they hear a second rifle shot, and it was a 19-year-old former student who was a wrestling teammate and had been a wrestling coach at the school, who fired a shot as a sniper that targeted this kid getting on the bus, and then he killed himself. That's the type of violence that is happening every week at schools. And unfortunately, lots of it is in these very rural, very small, very tight-knit communities.
When you started talking about what stood out about Madison's shooting last year in December, what I thought you would say is that it is rare that this kind of violence is perpetrated by somebody who is a cisgender girl. I didn't expect you to say that it was a planned attack, and that actually separates it from the vast majority. So you said you've looked at 3,400 school shootings about, and of those 3,400, 326 were planned. I hope I got your numbers right. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
226.
226 were planned.
Yeah, so a little less than 10% of them.
Okay, talk to me about the planning process that went into the attack in Madison. It seems like if it's a planned attack, there should be some warning signs. Maybe there are some cues we missed. Maybe there are some things we could have done to prevent this, because the student had been considering this and collaborating with folks online to perpetrate it.
Exactly. That's the other misconception, that somebody snaps and then they decide to commit a school shooting, or somehow there's contagion where somebody sees something on TV and then they decide they're going to commit a school shooting the next day. That's not the case at all, either now or dating back to the 1960s. School shootings are almost always deliberately planned for months, years, even multiple years. Last year was the 25th anniversary of the Columbine shooting. And almost every modern school shooting has some sort of reference or inspiration linked to Columbine. Backing up, so that's 2024 is the 25-year anniversary. 3 years prior to that, there were 2 students arrested for plotting a shooting for the 25th anniversary of Columbine. So 3 years before the anniversary, they were building pipe bombs, drawing maps, trying to get tactical equipment, slowly stealing ammunition and gun parts from their family members, because they lived in rural Pennsylvania where every one of their family members had multiple guns in the house. So if they take a bullet or 2 every month, nobody's going to notice that those are missing. If you take the old gun from grandpa's drawer, there's a chance to notice that gun's missing. So we have to realize that these attacks are plotted for a long period of time. And during that time, many of these kids are doing this for attention. They're doing it because they feel like they have a grievance that's not being noticed, that they're not being seen, that nobody's taking them seriously. So they're doing things like leaving weapons out, leaving drawings, maps of the school, having journals where the journals write on their desk with hundreds of pages about their plot. They almost all make shrines to previous school shooters. So in a kid's room, if there are a whole bunch of graphic pictures and you put those pictures into ChatGPT and say, who are these people? If a kid is plotting a school shooting, those people are usually school shooters. So they are making these very overt signs. And in this case in Madison, in the months leading up to it, there are photos posted by the girl's father of her at the shooting range. And at the shooting range, she's wearing a KMFDM t-shirt. And that's a German industrial band from the 1990s that was featured in the Columbine basement tapes. So she was laying these signs right out there in the open, saying, please notice this. Somebody, please ask me why I'm doing this. They're always giving these opportunities for intervention. And then her social media profile is she had totally normal day written in her bio line. And that's a code word for TND, which is a white nationalist slogan for total N-word death. And so she had this sign right in her bio line saying, I'm a white nationalist. I'm thinking about violence. This is the groups I'm associated with. So we've got to realize these things are not secrets. They're not really done in private. They're meant to be public. And that entire planning process is intended to be public.
I think it's really hard to reconcile that a 15-year-old girl would, have this long historical relationship with, school shootings, and then be sending very kind of subtle cues to everyone around her that that's something she's considering. Do you think this is something we need to build greater awareness of as a community, as educators? Should we all know? I read an article that my brilliant producer, Sarah, sent to me that you had contributed to, or I think actually that you had written in its entirety, about Nick Fuentes and I want to say the Groypers. And, I had a more peaceful brain before I learned about the Groypers. So it's hard to think we want every educator and every parent to be well-oriented to their kids being vulnerable to white nationalism, influencing them to commit mass murder of people of color. I think the other thing is that Madison is a mostly white community. This kid went to a majority white private Christian school. Why would that be the target of this kind of racist suicide mission?
It's because these teenagers and even your young adult mass shooters, they don't really have a coherent worldview. They are angry in every direction. I think a much better framing of this is the concept of nihilistic violence, that there are people that once you don't believe in anything, the Groyper movement is that Western society has failed. The idea of having an integrated multicultural society has failed. You as a white man are never going to be successful. You're never going to have a good opportunity again. So when this society is never going to do anything for you, then it's fine to resort to violence. It's fine to resort to hateful language and memes and talk about suicide or committing self-harm on camera, because nothing matters. Is the worldview that they're spreading.
I've got to pause you right there. I don't understand what reinforces that, right? We live in a society where white people own the majority of property and businesses and are greatly empowered through their identities and have been over history. And that hasn't changed in real ways for the most part. I think the idea that kids who have an unfair shot at life are more likely to be profoundly violent, wouldn't that mean that the majority of mass shooters were kids from disenfranchised backgrounds, kids who, are being discriminated against regularly, kids who are from immigrant families and, feel targeted by ICE? Why is it white kids who, in reality their identity advantages them in every aspect of reality in this country?
Well, with school shooters and mass shooters specifically, there's almost always a history of abuse, substance abuse, and suicidality. So these are people that don't want to live. They usually have either diagnosed or all the symptoms of severe depression. Often they're abused at home and they have abusive parents who use drugs, alcohol, and other substances. So they do not have a stable home environment. And then often their school environment is very chaotic. Looking just prior to the shooting in Madison, there was a shooting at Appalachia High School in rural Georgia. And this was committed by a 14-year-old student. And he had attended schools in 5 different counties because his parents had a very chaotic relationship and situation. So he was constantly moving around. He had been taken from his parents by 6 different social service agencies, all in different counties. And this is rural Georgia, so there's not a lot of money for social services. So they're not communicating with each other. And as this kid's really having a hard time in the real world, he gets involved with true crime community and some of these other radicalizing communities online. And there he finds community. He finds people that will say you're amazing, people that will like all of your statuses. So people are always searching for validation. They're always searching for recognition. And if they're not getting any of it in the real world, then an online community, which is saying you're amazing, you do this, you participate in this attack, we're going to remember you forever. You're going to be in our profile names forever. Your picture is going to be in the collage. The Last Supper dinner is something that's shown all the time with different school shooters' faces superimposed over the people at the table. You get to be in this canonical representation of our community forever. And then that gets combined with very bad decisions by the parents. So this kid in Southern Georgia, he's really down. He's having issues. So his dad gets him an AR-15 rifle for Christmas to try to cheer him up. Very similar to what we saw in Madison, Wisconsin, where shooting was the primary bonding activity for the father and daughter, and he left these firearms that were accessible in the home to her. So it's chaotic home situations, feeling like you don't fit in, real or perceived, at school. Some parents that do some things that really make committing a school shooting very easy. In a study of the life histories of school shooters back to the 60s, 98% of them came from a home where there was open access to firearms. So if there are firearms left around in your house, that's very, very easy to commit a school shooting. If you don't have access, it's very hard to commit a school shooting. And they get their validation from the completely wrong source. And then that turns into this violent attack.
I want to talk to you a little bit more about the gropers and a little bit more about true crime and how the Madison school shooter is being received by that community after the shooting. But first, I want to remind folks who are listening, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to A Public Affair on WORT 89.9 FM Madison. My name is Ali Muldrow, and today we're talking with David Riedman. If you have questions or comments, give us a call. The number is 608-256-2001. David knows a lot about the shootings that have happened here in our community and shootings that have happened all over the place, including the recent shooting at Brown University. We want to hear from you. We want to know what you think. We want to hear your suggestions in terms of what we should be doing to address this. The number, again, is 608-256-2001. Huge shout out to our receptionist, Mary Jo, our engineer, Jeff, our incredible producer, Sarah, and our news director, Nate. Y'all are the absolute best. So grateful for the team here at WORT. Thank you all for tuning in to A Public Affair and having this really important conversation with us. David, tell me a little bit more about true crime. I'm sure there's a lot of listeners out there like me who do not just haven't found their way into this kind of conversation, this community, these sorts of memes, and having deep dived it last week because of you, I feel informed in a really important but stressful way. And so I apologize ahead of time to my listeners, but I think you need to be informed in a really important and stressful way. What is true crime doing to celebrate or acknowledge the shooting that happened here in Madison? How is that young person being remembered by the online community that promoted the shooting she participated in or she perpetrated?
Yeah, when you say true crime, there are all of these podcasts of amateur sleuths investigating cold cases, and some of them have been very popular. Some of them made into Netflix series. That is not what we're talking about. True crime podcasts are not this. True crime community is pound TCC. And TCC is on Twitter, on Instagram, on Snapchat, on any of your algorithmic media apps. And what it is really three elements. You share the most graphic, violent content that you can find. So since especially Twitter removed all of the trust and safety, and Instagram has significantly reduced its trust and safety overview, you can now share ISIS beheadings, electrocutions, industrial machine accidents, videos of suicide bombers being blown up, videos of people being shot, videos of people killing themselves, cutting themselves. So if you just post a video like that with the hashtag #TCC, dozens or hundreds of people will like and reshare and give you kind of the credit and validation that you're contributing to this community. So the first thing
David,
is that
have you done this?
I have never cut or shot myself on video.
No, but I mean, have you
No.
reposted something like this? And
I have
then
not reposted. I have not reposted any of it. But if you just look on, say, for example, Twitter right now, just put in #TCC. Go to Instagram and put #TCC. You will find a ton of this very violent core content. The second piece of that is to kind of role play and cosplay and glorify prior school shooters and mass shooters. And ChatGPT and Google's new image generator and all the different AI tools have really accelerated this, because if you make fan art, if you make panel cartoons, pictures that glorify any of these prior shooters, you post those with the hashtag TCC and people will start to share and like your content. So you need to glorify, kind of role play as school shooters. And then the third element is you incorporate TCC into your handle, into your bio. You might take a name that's a nickname of a prior school shooter. You would add things like some of their kind of coded slogans into your bio. And once you've done enough to get kind of into the community, you'll get invited to a private Discord group. And then within the private Discord group, because that's a fully encrypted, distributed server network where you cannot easily subpoena or identify any of the information in these, then you can start openly talking about attacks. And the Discord group, school shooting massacre discussions, was something that a 17-year-old student at Perry Middle and High School in Perry, Iowa, was part of in January 2024. So he went into his school with a shotgun in his bag. He went into the bathroom before classes started, got on school shooting massacre discussions on Discord, talked to other kids, said, I'm going to do this. I'm ready to go. They all said, you're ready to go. He posted the KMFDM song that was in the Columbine tapes. That's the same band that was the t-shirt worn by the Madison school shooter. He posted that. That's his last post. And then he went out and opened fire in the hallway and shot 8 people, including killing the principal and a 12-year-old student. Then just a couple months after that, also in Wisconsin, there was the shooting at Mount Horeb Middle School. And that was a 14-year-old student with an air rifle. His family was anti-gun, so he couldn't get access to weapons. He talked about he loved AR-15s, but he couldn't get access to an AR-15. But he tricked his parents into taking him to the site of a prior school shooting. He wrote about being obsessed with school shootings. He said, if I was addicted to a substance, I could get help, but I'm addicted to school shootings, so nobody could help me. So he went on to attempt a school shooting with that air rifle, even though he didn't have a real gun. He's in the same community, the same true crime community. Right after that, we talked about the Appalachia High School shooting that was in September. This shooting in Madison happened in December of last year, of 2024. And just about 3 weeks after it, in January 2025, there was a shooting at Antioch High School in Tennessee. And this student took the same username as the Madison school shooter. He put her name into his handle, and then he took mirrored photographs that were exactly like the last photographs that she posted before he opened fire in the cafeteria. So these are just examples of, there have been 8 different attacks since January 2024, all committed by teenage students at the school who were all part of this true crime community, who were all talking with each other on Discord and Instagram and Twitter, and they were all plotting or carrying out actual violence.
That is pretty terrifying. I think as a parent, it's really hard to hear that these are the kinds of communities that young people are cultivating. And it's hard to imagine how to be aware enough to recognize when a young person is participating in something like that online. I think, obviously, given the information you have, it must be hard to see how schools respond to school shootings because we're not really getting at the root cause. So in Madison, after the school shooting in December last year, there was, some protest and some conversation, but the most salient voice in the community was young people demanding 2 things: greater access to mental health support and safe storage of weapons. Do you think that those young people are on the right track in terms of what they're advocating for to address this issue?
Absolutely. I mean, going to that study of the life history of school shooters, the common factor that was in 98% of the cases back to the 60s is that there's open access to firearms in the house. That means it was graded on a 1 through 5 scale. That means 1, that there are unlocked, loaded firearms just laying around the house for them to be able to take. 98%. Also within that 98% is that, and this maybe speaks to why so many of these shootings take place in rural and small suburban areas, is in those families, firearm use, either hunting or sport shooting or target shooting, was the primary leisure activity for the family. So if that's your entire identity is built around firearm use and they're always around the house and they're easily available, if a kid ends up in this crisis situation where they think they have no other options, they're suicidal, they're involved with an online community that is saying, do this, you'll be great, you'll be recognized, you'll be remembered forever. And they've also been taught that firearms are the most important thing and they solve every problem and they're, this and that, then that kid is easily going to take that gun that's just laying in their house and they may open fire in their school. And the issue is so much information is available in these. So fast forwarding to September of this year, there was a shooting just outside of Denver in kind of foothill suburbs. Really good school. The number 1 rated school in Colorado is Evergreen High School. And this 16-year-old kid opened fire in the cafeteria. He was part of TCC. He was part of Watch People Die, which is another website that's available to anyone. It's some pretty horrific content. But he was reported to the FBI over the summer. And the FBI said, this is inconclusive. We can't go anywhere with this. So an issue is federal law enforcement, in some cases, doesn't understand these threats. And in other cases is being sent to focus on immigration or redacting case files instead of investigating school shootings. The threat that was reported to the FBI was right around that same weekend that 1,000 FBI agents were pulled from their desks to do a crash review of some high-profile documents. So you don't know definitively, but if the FBI is being pulled in other directions, does that mean that they're not investigating school shootings? And I think it's pretty clear from the opportunities to prevent so much of this violence, we think that federal law enforcement knows everything, but they continue to miss the same warning signs over and over for decades at this point.
Do you think it's more important that folks work with local law enforcement?
I think that this can happen in the home and it can happen in the community. Again, these shootings are not planned in secret. And I think it's important for parents to remember that your kid's computer and your kid's phone is not their private space. It's not their private property. What's in their backpack is not their private space and their private property. If parents check the kid's backpack for a gun or check to make sure that their guns weren't missing, most of these school shootings wouldn't happen. If parents looked at their kids' online activity and saw that they're sharing ISIS beheadings and talking about how they're in love with the Columbine shooters, these shootings wouldn't happen. It's on parents to be informed about what their kids are doing.
I struggle with that as a parent who does not have guns, right? So I feel like for me, what I hear is you shouldn't have a gun around your children. It's dangerous for a lot of reasons, and it's dangerous for my 4-year-old in a different way than it's dangerous for my 16-year-old, but it's dangerous for kids to be around guns. And if I don't have them in my home, there's a 98% chance that my child is not going to perpetrate a school shooting. I think some of the advice you just gave is specific to families who have armed their children.
That is true. But even for parents, for example, the kid at Mount Horeb Middle School, he was obsessed with school shootings. There would have been a lot of information if they looked at his computer that they would have seen what he was writing. He was writing a lot of hate speech about Black people, about Jews, about the LGBTQ community, talking about the problems with feminism and diversity, very similar to the Groyper messages. This kid was 14, and he'd been engaging with that stuff for a couple of years. A lot of radicalization is starting preteen now with kids that are in middle school or even elementary school. I think one of the most terrifying trends that I've seen is there's a game most parents will know called Roblox, and it's a big open world build game. Well, half of Roblox users are under 12. The other half of the users are not under 12. You know, nobody's going to let their kid play at the playground with a random adult, but you might let your kid play on Roblox for hours with a random adult. And then that random adult invites your kid to come to a special map that they made. And there are maps in Roblox for the Uvalde school shooting, for the Columbine school shooting, where you can play as the shooter in a Roblox scenario. If the kid is into that, this is how online grooming happens. Then the adult will invite them to come to a private Discord. And in that private Discord, say, you know, you're amazing, you're so much smarter, you're so much more beautiful than, you know, your friends. And that adult will just groom the kid into becoming a true crime community member, into becoming a violent offender. And that's this pathway to radicalization that can start by targeting kids in elementary school. And parents just need to realize that the online world has the same level of danger and scrutiny that the real world has. So if you would never let your kid play alone at a playground, why would you possibly let your kid be on Roblox without any adult supervision or keeping track of what's going on in that place?
Dr. David, I will tell you why you would let your kid play Roblox, partially because I don't think you're aware of how harmful it can be. I have definitely, if you are out there listening right now and you are like totally letting your kids play Roblox, I am with you. I have, especially during the pandemic, I think we really relied on our kids experiencing like their social reality online. And I think for the most part, my kids were like playing dress up on Roblox. I don't think that they were acting out Uvalde shootings. And I can't know for sure because I would be super dishonest if I said every time my child has ever opened Roblox, I've been sitting next to them while they play. I think some of what you said is so incredibly terrifying, and you want to believe as a parent that we're parenting in community, that we care about each other's children and our own children. And at the same time, I think a lot of people are balancing parenthood with work and a series of other responsibilities that can make it really challenging to be aware of your kid at all times. And I think, monitoring your kids online is a real sophisticated task, especially because our young people are really different than us. I'm an elder millennial. I didn't grow up with Google. It didn't exist until I was in high school. There was no Facebook until I was in college. I have never practiced for a school shooting at school. There is a real generational divide between us and our children. And I think how we scale that divide is part of the reason having this conversation with you, Dr. David, is super important.
And that's a good thing. So parents don't need to feel hopeless in this, because the kid is not going to be instantly radicalized by one day and one conversation on Roblox. It's going to be something that takes place over weeks and months. So if suddenly they change from being really open with talking to you about what they were doing, to talking with their friends, to suddenly they're being very secretive about it. Suddenly they're doing things that you can tell they're not being completely transparent. And then where a lot of the behaviors would then shift towards, you can see somebody is becoming radicalized, would then be that they have a shrine in their bedroom to a bunch of cartoon people that you don't recognize. What's great about the AI tools is you take a picture of that, say ChatGPT, who are these people? And it will do very well at identifying who those people are. Another sign is, because this all links back to Columbine and the school shootings in the 90s, there are a lot of retro things that kids are trying to do in association with these school shootings. For example, they almost always handwrite their notes and plans and manifestos. And it's usually in those 90s style marble notebooks, wide lines, and like that 3 by 7.5, notebook with a cardboard cover.
There's a nostalgia aesthetic for school shootings?
Absolutely. It's about,
okay, but I also want you to know, like, there's this, I live with children, and there's like a nostalgia aesthetic. Like, so much of what you're saying is really challenging, because I'm like, I have a kid who's like obsessed with anime. Should I be scanning anime with images that she creates with ChatGPT to see if there's some like insidious thing that I'm not catching? Like, I mean, I think so much of what you're describing in a lot of ways feels like normal adolescent behavior. Like, a kid gets really into a rock group you've never heard of, or a kid, wants to cultivate a really specific aesthetic that's like associated with the 90s. I think if we thought of every kid who is doing that as a potential school shooter, like, we would never sleep again. David?
Yeah, it's the certain parts of it. And that's a big appeal of true crime community, or of plotting these school shootings, is that you're pulling one over on the adults, that you're planning this right under their nose and they don't notice. So lots of kids are making anime creations. The entire world was making anime creations when ChatGPT's image generator debuted. But it's that the images that they're creating are anime representations of the most famous school shooters. So parents should know what the Sandy Hook school shooter looks like, what the Columbine school shooters looked like, what they wore, the Wrath t-shirt, the Natural Selection t-shirt, the kind of hollow face of the Sandy Hook shooter. I just saw a live video on Twitter a couple weeks ago where there was a kid using an hourglass filter. And so he had a side-by-side screen, and one of them was Adam Lanza, the really hollow-faced Sandy Hook shooter. And the other was, he was trying to fit his face into that hourglass filter to make his cheeks look just like Adam Lanza. And so he's doing this live on video, and he's saying, I just want to look like Adam. I just want to look like Adam. And that is, lots of kids play with filters, and that's just fine. When your kid is using the filter to try to look and represent and internalize themselves as the Sandy Hook school shooter, that's when there's a problem. Anime cartoons, not a problem at all. When your kid is making fan fiction anime of them being friends with and talking to the Columbine school shooters in their anime version, that's when there's a problem.
Talk to us a little bit about the Brown University shooting and what makes that shooting stand out. And then I really do want to get into a little bit of the Groyper movement and how that connects to the larger conversation about what it means to radicalize young people online and groom them for horrific acts of violence.
At Brown University, for anybody who wasn't following the news, at 4 p.m. on Saturday, an adult dressed in all black with a hat and a mask and gloves opened fire in a big auditorium in one of the large science and engineering buildings on the campus. 2 students were killed, 9 students were wounded, most of them critically, and then this adult just walked away from the campus. Now it's been, at this point, almost 4 days since the shooting, and there's no suspect that's been identified for that. As I said at the start of this show, almost all school shootings and mass shootings are violent public suicides, where somebody with a direct connection to the campus thinks that the only way that they can settle their grievance is to be seen by harming others and then to die in the process of that attack. The Brown University shooting is strange because there's no manifesto, there's no reason, the person didn't commit suicide, and when we don't know who it is, you have no idea what this connection to the campus is. This is the first mass shooting that I can ever think of where it's been 4 days and there's no suspect identified.
Yeah, I think that stands out to me because it was such a public act of violence. I can't imagine that Brown University doesn't have a decent amount of security footage, campus police. So for somebody to be able to evade all of that over the course of the last 4 days seems, pretty rare. Is there something specific about this shooter that we should understand in terms of how they fall out of alignment with other shooters? Do you think that this particular mass shooter is just so skilled and so sophisticated that law enforcement will struggle to find them? Or do you think that law enforcement is dropping the ball? And I guess it could also be too soon to say.
Again, I've read the manifestos of dozens of school shooters. I've seen interviews. I've talked to a convicted school shooter. They don't have escape plans. All of the planning, all of the journals, all of the manifestos go right up to the point of the shooting and what they're going to do during the shooting. But there's never a plan for after the shooting. They intend to either kill themselves, be killed by police, or commit a social suicide, which is being arrested and they're going to go life in prison without parole and never leave. There's never this attack, this escape plan. When they do leave the scene, they almost always commit suicide away from the scene. So at Michigan State a couple of years ago, there was a shooting in 2 buildings on campus by a man with no connection to the school. It's still not clear why he did it. And he committed suicide a couple blocks from the campus and was found a couple hours later by police. The bowling alley shooting in Maine that happened 2 summers ago, a really high profile mass shooting at 2 different locations in this small town in Maine. Originally, police were thinking that guy had escaped because he was former military or active duty military, had all this survival training and so on. He was found dead in a storage unit pretty close to the location of the shooting. And then at Denver East High School a couple of years ago, there was a student who, when he was being searched, he shot 2 administrators at the school. And then he fled from the campus. And then a number of hours later, he was found in a park outside of Denver, and he had committed suicide there. So I would say, based on just the probabilities from looking at hundreds of school shootings and mass shootings, there's a very good chance that this person already committed suicide. Their body just hasn't been found. And then there's also a small chance that somebody that wore a hat glove and masks, maybe purchased a ghost gun online, was very careful not to leave fingerprints on any of the ammunition, that if you commit a completely random act of violence, you're careful about how you get there and leave, and you never tell anyone about it, there's a pretty good chance that you'll never be caught. Because in the last year of FBI crime data for 2023, 42% of homicides were not solved.
Wow. I mean, those are some really stark realities to take into consideration as we think about how to prevent school shootings, how to respond to school shootings. In Wisconsin, it's not that no one was punished for this shooting. The father of this child has been arrested and is being held accountable for arming a child who killed multiple people, shot themselves, injured a decent number of their classmates. Is that something we should plan to see more of? Parents who are arming their students ending up incarcerated. The other thing is there's a person in California who is arrested in relationship to this shooting here in Madison because of some of the relationship they had with this student online. Talk to us a little bit about those dynamics and whether or not the right move after a school shooting is to hold families accountable and maybe online community members accountable for this violence.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of precedence with holding the purchaser of a firearm accountable for the shooting. The parents in Oxford, Michigan, who bought a gun for Black Friday special at a pre-Christmas present for their son, who was actively talking about being suicidal and wanting to commit violence, when he opened fire in his school and killed 6 classmates. Both of his parents are, I believe, they've been convicted of manslaughter in that case. The Appalachia high school shooting in Georgia, that parent was also arrested because he bought his 15-year-old kid who was having pretty severe, or his 14-year-old kid who was having pretty severe issues, an AR-15 rifle. So there are parents that are being held accountable. If I was in charge of policy in the country, when a firearm is a deadly weapon, you have the responsibility to be forever accountable to that firearm. So I would make the legal owner of a firearm responsible for any harm that is ever done with that weapon, regardless of who has it. And if you knew that buying a firearm carries that level of legal responsibility into perpetuity, I think people would be very careful with how they lock and secure and use their firearms. Also, I think that even though people make questionable financial decisions with buying very expensive firearms and then not buying a gun safe, I think we could do well with, public health interventions have shown if you give stuff for free, people will use it. Give nice gun safes away for free to anybody that wants them, not the stupid little, combination locks, little cables. Look at the nicest gun safe that's available at whatever store they like, and have a credit to be able to do that. I think help people store firearms and then make people realize that owning something that has the power to kill innocent people needs to carry a lot of responsibility. That's what the spirit of the Constitution is all about, is that responsibility of bearing arms.
I really appreciate you speaking to that. And in a lot of ways, I think I really support the young people of our community who have said we want better access to mental health support, we want safe storage. These seem like such reasonable ways to try to prevent this type of violence from impacting our community in the future. And yet it hasn't been widely embraced by our legislature or the folks who could make that happen. I want to talk to you about the Groypers, because I've said the word Groyper a lot today. How are they influencing school shootings? How are they changing the conversation around violence at school? And how can we prepare for what their influence means for our young people?
Yeah, the Groyper movement, parents aren't familiar with it, so true crime community does not have a founder, doesn't have a person attached with it, doesn't really have membership or ideology or like a clear purpose. The Groyper movement is the followers of Nick Fuentes, who is a self-proclaimed neo-Nazi and white nationalist. And he has a live online show that gets between hundreds of thousands and millions of listens. And he's been platformed by a lot of kind of mainstream conservative personalities. But his whole message is that Western society is broken, that you as a white man have been marginalized. And because society has ended, we are at war. He talks about the Groyper Wars. And one of his wars was against Turning Point USA, which was the organization of Charlie Kirk. And he was at war with Charlie Kirk because he believed that that was not a conservative enough movement. So he would order the Groypers to crash Turning Point USA events, to spam their comment sections during live streams. And that could turn into real world action. That you go from being a lurker in a chat where you're just watching his show, you're just reading the comments, into you become a commenter, until you become a member of the Groypers, where you change your profile picture to a frog, which is their symbol, that you add Groyper into your name, that you do other coded things that are all in the article that you referenced, and hopefully that can be in the show notes here. That you are becoming part of that Groyper army and part of that Groyper identity. And if you believe that Western society is fundamentally broken and over, and you have that completely nihilistic worldview, then violence doesn't matter. Then your life doesn't matter because the world doesn't have any purpose. So that's what that Groyper mentality is that only through the total destruction of our current society can we kind of rise again as this exclusively white, male-dominated Christian nationalist society.
It's some pretty terrifying stuff. And at the same time, some of it feels really familiar. Even in a place as progressive as Madison, the idea of racialized difference is pronounced and is, I think something that we really struggle to address in real ways. I have a note from our amazing producer. So this is our last question for the hour. She was in middle school during
I'll pause on that real quickly on this, just to Natalie, or the Madison school shooter. It's also women that can internalize it, because in her manifestos, she wrote that I'm part of this war against humanity. And she described, the other races as filth. So just bringing all this connection together, it's a big overlapping Venn diagram of nihilistic violence, of school shootings, of true crime community, of Groypers, of white nationalism, of neo-Nazi groups, that all sits in the same space. And every one of those things were a factor here in Madison.
I really appreciate you speaking to that. We are running out of time so quickly that I'm not going to get to this question that I think is super important about, how we tell the stories of school shootings. I think one of the things that you do that is so important to us here at WORT is that you use real data to talk about what school shootings actually are, and you kind of get rid of this like boogeyman that is going to break into schools, and you remind us that these are young people for the most part perpetrating these crimes. Dr. David Riedman, I cannot thank you enough for joining us today on WORT 89.9 FM. I'm your host, Ali Muldrow. This is A Public Affair. I hope one day I get to have you on this show to talk about something a lot more hopeful. But until then, we're so grateful for what you do.
Thank you for the time.